Hey everyone, this is Fencing Flops. I'm here with my buddy Rob from McDojoLife. He's a YouTuber and he does a lot of videos where he takes a look at, martial artists kind of passing off martial arts that aren't quite legitimate, and he goes ahead and exposes them. So I thought it's somewhat close to what I'm trying to do. So recently I've been reviewing this fencing series called Attack at Lightning.
Okay.
And so the protagonist is a boxer slash MMA fighter, I'm not totally sure, who switches over to fencing. And as I was watching it, I thought, okay, this protagonist is advancing a little too quickly to be realistic. But then I realized if an MMA fighter did come over to fencing, I wouldn't know what sort of advantages or disadvantages they might encounter.
Hmm.
So I looked out across the internet and, I asked Rob if he wanted to weigh in on this.
Sure.
So,
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, when it comes down to people switching from different arts or different sports, there are always going to be some things that are going to be hindrances to you, like bad habits that are going to come over because that's not necessarily what's allowed in the sport. For instance, even from wrestling to jujitsu, one thing that wrestlers typically do is they'll go belly down and flat so that way you can't pin them if they get caught in a vulnerable position. You can't do that in MMA. You can't do that in jiu-jitsu. So that's not necessarily a good habit, but one of the great habits that they have is they have incredible takedowns and knowledge of positional dominance. So wrestlers do really well about being positionally dominant when they switch over to a different grappling art like MMA, or they switch over to sambo or jiu-jitsu or whatever other grappling art they may do. Now, when it comes to martial artists in general, especially boxers who switch over from MMA, boxing, kickboxing, things like that, typically when you're in a stance and you're doing a jab, which is off your lead hand, that would be very similar like in fencing. I'm not exactly sure the technical term because I'm not a fencer, but I would say like a straight on stab or a lunge. I think it might be what it's called. But when you're stepping forward in fencing, you step forward with your lead foot. You don't actually take a walking step where you're changing your lead foot with your other. And so that's very typical in boxing. You'll see that in pretty much any striking art where the lead leg stays in the lead. And then as you go to take a step, you throw the jab out there, which would be extremely similar to how you would need to operate when I've seen people fence. That lead leg typically stays in the lead, although the stance and the posture is different. The idea and the thought process are very similar. Like when I've seen lunges in fencing, I see deep lunges, like big steps. That lead leg is, or that back leg
yeah,
is way back there, almost straight. And then the
yeah,
lead leg
yeah.
is super bent. And so that way you can get a good stab, right? The only real difference would be is training that person to keep that leg in the back and be able to push off and take that lunging step, but elongate themselves just for a different purpose. But it wouldn't be that difficult to switch from one to the other with just a few corrections and a good coach.
Okay, yeah. So, thing you mentioned about wrestling, I've already learned something new. I did not know that you couldn't do that in MMA. So
I mean,
what?
you can, but like, just to toss it out there, right? In wrestling, they can't punch you or choke you,
Yeah.
right? Like, so if you go belly down, the reason you're going belly down in wrestling is so that way it's harder for them to get a good grip on you to flip you over and pin you on your shoulders, which is how you would win the match. But in MMA, if you go belly down out of habit, they're just going to take your back and punch you in the face. In jiu-jitsu, if you go belly down, they're going to say, okay, they're going to take your back and choke you to sleep, right? So
Okay.
as
So,
learn one, like one, it's one of those things where it's like, oh, well, I will do this on purpose. The other one will be like, I will avoid this at all costs, that kind of thing.
okay. So it is allowed. It's just usually not a good
Yeah,
idea.
it's just not smart. It's just
Okay.
not smart.
Okay. So with what you were mentioning about, strikes with the fist as opposed to usually they're called extensions with or thrusts with a fencing blade. I do definitely see the correlation there, and part of the reason I wanted to reach out is because I didn't have someone to talk about this with, and I couldn't find anyone who had. I'd found a few people who had gone from fencing to a martial art, but never the other way around.
Mm.
So, I really wanted to get, more of an informed opinion. But what you were talking about just then was definitely correct. It was something that someone had brought up once, how in boxing, you come with your back foot forward when you strike with the opposing arm. And in fencing, that's not only discouraged, but it's improper form. And in two so if for anyone who's not certain, there are three styles of fencing, each with a different weapon, each with a slightly different rule set. Within two of those styles, stepping forward with your back leg while you extend with your uh, attacking arm, technically that is allowed. It's just not a good idea. But in the third style, it's not allowed at all.
Mm.
And that's for reasons I'm not going to get into, because that's a whole history of that weapon.
Yeah.
So I do see, though, if you were able to sort of fix that within the leg, that could help you. So that's sort of something that I was thinking about, like the advantage that a boxer or an MMA fighter would have when they go into fencing is not just, being accustomed to attacking with the proper arm, and like having a very straight arm when they do it. It's not, because I've taught a lot of beginners, and usually one of the first things that we have to teach them is, don't be afraid to actually hit your opponent. It's what you're here for. You need to actually go for it. I
Mm.
feel like an MMA fighter wouldn't have that issue, because they're
No.
all very accustomed to it.
Yeah,
But then
hitting people wouldn't be very hard.
yeah. But then the disadvantage to that is, like you said, with the back leg. There are a few attacks where you don't have to move your back leg at all, but the most common type of attack is the lunge, where you do have to, extend your back leg to push your body forward.
Mm.
So,
And there, and funny enough, like just to add to that, like there are certain styles that encourage that type of technique. So, like for instance, you're not going to see it very much in MMA. You'll see it every once in a while with guys like Michael Venom Page, Stephen Thompson, Raymond Daniels. You'll see it with those guys because they come from a sport karate background. But in sport karate, there's something called the blitz. It's a very simple day one kind of thing. But basically, what happens is with a blitz, is there are different types of blitzes, very similar to, like, I'm sure there are different types of lunges. I'm assuming little nuances in how to
yeah,
do it or
yeah, yeah,
preferences, but always ending pretty much in the same result, which is why it still gets the name. But with a blitz, it's very similar to that, but the difference is where normally, let's say your body is up and down, right? And I go to take a step, my whole body kind of comes with me, right? It's very up and down. What
yeah,
would that be considered? Perpendicular, right? Is
yeah,
that the word?
yeah,
Vertical. My body's vertical, right? And so I'm moving forward, and when I move forward, my body moves forward with me, and so my body stays in between my legs, so that way I can constantly be able to shift my weight left, right, forward, or back, depending on what I need to do at the moment. Well, a blitz doesn't do that. And what a blitz does is when you're about to throw that jab or that cross, you actually take your body and you do this at an angle. So you're almost jumping at the person, like spring loading yourself forward, but that back leg remains planted and your entire body kind of becomes almost like the superhero shape where you're like driving in and as you're pushing off that back leg. Now, there are a lot of different types of blitzes, but the thing that really makes it a blitz is that your body does this. It kind of no longer is up and down, but your body actually elongates over your legs as you're lunging forward. And I would imagine that that's something that could probably be translated really well and easily based off of, okay, well, I need you to leave your back leg back there. You can push off of it, I guess. Your front leg is not going to be bent, as you kind of land on that leg and try to elongate yourself to push your body forward to be able to go into the attack. But even like sport karate, I'm sure there are a lot of similarities with fencing. So especially with the lead hand punching, like whether it be a jab or whether it be a front hand punch, which is more like vertical fist punching. Um, every style probably has something very similar that can kind of interweave in there.
It's really interesting that you mentioned the blitz, because I'd never heard of it before. And like you said, I think that would translate very well to lunges. It would just be something that I guess isn't used very often in karate, or at least isn't something that you see every single match,
Mm,
as opposed to now using it multiple times in a single bout. But
mm.
I just wanted to bring up something that is really interesting, that actually really translates very well to a type of attack in fencing known as the flesh. which
Okay.
means arrow in French. And the reason they call it arrow is if you ever take a look at it online, it's very appropriate. When fencers lunge, proper form is to have, despite the fact that they're, stepping forward and pushing themselves forward quite a bit, to have their torsos upright. Because the thing is, if the lunge doesn't work, you still have to use that blade for defense. So if your
Mm.
torso is upright, it really helps you to recover from that. The flesh is a running attack that does not, adhere to that principle of I might have to defend myself afterwards.
Mm.
It's basically a Hail Mary pass, throw caution to the winds. I'm going to stick my blade out at you and run. And it's done to such an extreme that, normally fencers aren't allowed to pass each other on the strip. They have
Yeah.
to remain in front of each other. The flesh is the only exception to that. And so what they'll do is they will begin their flesh and they will launch themselves not just off of their back foot, but then continue that to launch themselves off of their front foot and basically try and hit their opponent and then run past them. Running away from their opponent past them is your defense if you
Mm.
fail. So that's actually the blitz, like you mentioned, the footwork part of it is very similar to a lot of lunges, but the
Mm.
footwork and the torso is even more similar to another type of attack.
Mm.
So that's sort of an example of, the parallels I'm trying to come up with. On one hand, part of it is very useful. On the
Mm.
other, you know, a flesh is the kind of thing that you would do, if you were very familiar with it, maybe once in a whole tournament. It's
Mm.
something that you're not supposed to do very often.
Mm.
Because the thing is, not only is it pretty strenuous compared to a lot of other attacks, and its lack of defense is the reason a lot of people don't like doing it unless unless they're either sure that they can get away with it or their opponent is, getting the better of them and they're desperate to change things up.
Mm.
That's usually the situation that someone would preserve a flesh for. So you don't use it very often. So definitely if someone was too accustomed to that just, blitzing motion, that rushing forward thing that matches the flesh very well,
Mm.
it does mean that your fleshes would probably start off pretty well and you would, really pick them up quickly.
Mm.
But it also means that it would be more likely that a lot more of your attacks, like a lot more attacks than you should be, are very reminiscent of a flesh, which, if you're doing it all the time, is pretty easy to defend against if you see it coming.
Mm.
So I think that's like sort of an advantage and a disadvantage sort of rolled into one.
Mm.
So sort of the sense that I got from a lot of MMA fighters is that, their footwork is very fluid, and so is their, that I'm not sure what you would call it whenever they're doing anything with their hands. With fencers, it's just called blade work. So like, what would you call that in MMA? Just
Well, I
working with your
mean,
hands.
MMA, the the actual letters MMA mean mixed martial arts. So when you're looking at MMA fighters, most of the time you're going to get such a wide variety of technique and backgrounds and footwork, and each one of those things comes from that particular person's background and style. For instance, if you look at somebody like, we'll just go back to these stylists who are like more karate based, right? If you look at somebody like Stephen Thompson, he fights very sideways. He's very bouncy, and he fights with a very sport karate style, a lot of lead leg kicking. Whereas the rest of the division probably never throws a lead leg kick unless it's like a front kick, right? Because that's where he came from. Same thing with Raymond Daniels and Michael Venom Page. Those three guys can usually be kind of put in that category because their base style is sport karate. So their footwork is way different than if you look at a guy who has like a Muay Thai background, or if you look at a guy who has like a wrestling background. All of those people will have a very unique way of lining up and setting themselves up. Now, if you're talking about like in terms of breaking things down into categories, for instance, you said hands, right? Usually in MMA, it's typically referred to as striking, right? How you throw your hands is basically your striking game. Also, could be how you throw your elbows, your knees, and your kicks. Anything that will actually land and strike your opponent is your striking game. Typically, when you're talking about standing and your hands, it's usually referred to as your guard, like keeping your hands up, right? But also, confusing enough, is I've also, also on the ground when you're on your back and your legs are in the air, your legs are your guard. So it's just kind of like how it's always been, right? Keep your guard up, keep your hands up, right? And so it just kind of depends on the style, but usually it's just referred to as your hands, right?
All
So
right.
like, but usually, like I said, it's broken down in like how this person's striking it. Okay, well that's one aspect of this game. All right, well how is their clenching, right? How is their entries, like for takedowns and things like that? How are their takedowns? How is their ground game? There's so many different little factors that you could be good at, because the ability to be good at fighting is the ability to be able to control the range of combat in which you're best at. And so I don't know if that has any similarities with fencing, but there are these different ranges that people want to hang out in. Of course, more the karate guys, right? They're going to want to hang out in that kicking, punching range. They're not going to want to really lock up with you. They're not really going to want to go to the ground with you, because that's just not that they can't do it. It's just that that's where they're more comfortable and they're more efficient, right? Whereas the grappler, somebody who's done jujitsu, sambo, wrestling, they're going to want to get you to the ground because that's where their base is and they're best at.
Okay. Yeah. Well, what you asked about, if that kind of applies to fencing. Yes, it definitely does. We're all taught the same thing, so it's not quite as varied as, MMA. But, a lot of fencers definitely do have preferred styles and everything. And we definitely have certain techniques that, all of us prefer. Funny story, this relates to what we're talking about, but I remember one time, when I'm fencing, I have a particularly good what's called parry six. It's basically a parry that covers a certain line of attack.
Mm.
And I, I remember I got so good at it at a point that I was fencing a guy one time, and he was so scared of moving into that parry six. He hadn't gotten as much tournament experience as I had, so
Mm.
he had trouble adapting to certain things. But I remember the longer the bout went on, the more his blade drifted over to the other side so that I wouldn't pick it up and, go in like that. So it's definitely, fencers definitely have that mentality of what am I best at and how can I get my opponent to that position where I have the advantage.
Mm.
But like I was saying, the consensus that I got from a lot of MMA that I've seen, which, admittedly, I haven't seen a lot, but what I have seen, it seems like, even when they're not on the ground, MMA fighters tend to really combine a lot of their footwork and what they're doing with their hands. So it really seems to be sort of like interconnected. And what I mean by that is that's something that I feel like might possibly be a small disadvantage if they went into fencing. Because while fencers do use their footwork and blade work, in conjunction with each other, they really try and combine all sorts of things. But I mean, the flip side to that is they're actually taught to sort of divide themselves, roughly around their waist, so that their legs can act independently of what their blade is doing. And what
Mm.
I mean by that is it's a lot easier to see with beginners because they don't have that down yet. They're still learning it. And so typically what you see is you see someone advance and then you see their blade move a little bit.
Mm.
Or they retreat and then they move it back because they think they're about to parry. So those small, what they're doing with their feet is directly affecting what they're doing with their blade, whether they mean to or not. So I think especially in my opinion, if someone came from MMA, they might, show that sort of behavior, but like have it be a lot more pronounced. Because this is my opinion. I could be wrong, but
Mm.
it feels like MMA fighters don't really, have that, cutoff level that sort of distinction between what their hands are doing, what their feet are doing. I feel like in MMA they work a lot more closely together, which would work in MMA, but is definitely something that they would have to work on in fencing. So I don't know if
I
you've
think
ever
that
noticed that.
when it comes down to like your body mechanics and striking and being able to mix arts, right? Usually, if you're trying to hit someone, like let's say with fencing, right? From what I've noticed, my goal is to hit you with the sword, right?
Yeah.
Whatever it may be. Typically, from what I've seen, the fencing that I've seen anyway, to stab you, right?
Yeah.
Stabbing you is awesome. That's cool. I don't really need to generate a lot of power to do so to be able to score that point. I just need it to be able to hit you, right?
Yeah.
Whereas
Yeah.
when dealing with like actual striking, when it comes to hitting people, your actual goal has changed. I can touch you all I really want, but if I just touch you, that's not going to actually get me closer to my goal, which would be to cause enough damage to where you want to quit, create some type of an injury in which you can no longer use that arm, that rib, or you're in such pain that you have difficulty functioning normally, knocking you unconscious, or submitting you and getting you to quit because you're just beaten either mentally, physically, or emotionally, which sometimes happens, right? Yeah, I hurt your
That
feelings.
happens in fencing too. I've been beaten emotionally long before the score limit runs out.
Exactly. You're like, all right, well, I'm just done. But
Yeah,
like that's
yeah.
the thing. It's like, so the mechanics of your feet are so important that they work together with your hands, but they also have to work together to get you from one range of combat to the next. For instance, if I throw a jab cross, right, my goal might be jab cross and then shoot in for a double leg takedown. Well, my feet work have to follow me very specifically in order for me to do that correctly. Because not only do I need to actually mechanically touch you, but I have to hit you hard enough for you to respect that to draw your hands up. So if I jab cross you and I just go boop, boop, you're going to go, and you're just going to ignore it and you're going to hit me back, right? But if I go wham, wham, and all of a sudden you go, oh, I don't want that, your hands come up to protect you. Well, now my feet are in the proper place for me able to drop that lead leg, shoot in, get my double leg takedown, and then really do it. Because again, just because I did the footwork right doesn't mean that it's going to be effective. I need to generate enough power to do so. So when I go to shoot in for that double, just because I mechanically did it and I grabbed your legs and I'm pushing with my ear, well, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to fall, right? I have to actually grab your legs. I have to plant my base and I have to drive you in order to get that to happen, you know? And so when you're dealing with a guy like me, like I'm 200 pounds, right? If I'm dealing with another guy who's 200 pounds, I would much rather do this to a guy who's 150, but I don't get that opportunity because of weight classes, right? You got to do it to a guy about your size. So you train and you work on that kind of stuff. So, but I will also say this, I do think that has a lot to do with your style. Like, again, that example would be somebody whose goal is to throw hands, get you to draw your hands up to defend yourself, to shoot in to get the double, right? The footwork has to be very particular to get that done correctly. If not, my head's on the wrong side. I drop you on top of my head. I knock myself unconscious. I shoot in. I didn't get enough. I didn't shoot in deep enough. Now you sprawl on me and I'm eating the mat, right? There's so many factors. But when it comes to like guys with different sets of skill sets, like a guy like Raymond Daniels, I think is a perfect example because Raymond Daniels is one of those guys who does these things that are damn near impossible to do for most any other person on the planet. But he's able to do it because he's practiced it just so much and he's got so much experience fighting. He'll do jump spinning 720 hook kicks and knock people out. Like he'll jump up in the air, spin 720 degrees, and then hook kick someone and knock them unconscious. He's done it before, right? And so when it comes to like making his hands and his legs do something different at different times, he would probably be one of those exceptions to the rule of his hands and his feet can work very much independently of each other because his ultimate goal is to use one to distract you from the other.
Okay. So whether or not they'd be able to do that, you think really depends on their style then.
Exactly. I think that what they're taught, because certain styles and certain coaches teach you very specific ways of doing things, whereas other styles and
Mhm.
coaches are going to teach you something maybe different because of the different goal that they have. Neither one of those things are necessarily wrong if they work, right? So
Yeah,
like
yeah.
I guess it could be like boiled down to being like a pitcher. If I have a pitching coach and he's showing me this is how I want you to hold the ball, this is how I want you to draw your knee up, this is how I want you to step, this is when I want you to release. All of those things might be different, but my original instructor probably put it the best I've ever heard it. It's the difference between system and style, right? So let's say the system is fencing. That means that these are the goals, these are the techniques, this is what you do. How you do those things is your style. So it's the same thing with a pitcher. The goal is simple. Take the ball, throw it over there, make sure the guy doesn't hit it. That's it, right? That's the system. That is pitching, right? But how you pitch, how you hold your body, how you take that step, how much you lean forward into your shot, where you put your finger. So that's your style. And so that's what you kind of get, which is why MMA is such a beautiful sport to me, is because it's a system. My goal is to hurt you. How do you do that? Good
Yeah.
luck. Figure it out. There's
Yeah.
plenty of ways to do it, you know. And so, like, how you put those pieces together, how you put those techniques together, how you put your footwork and your head movement and your takedowns and your clinch work and your boxing. And there's so many things that you can't get good at all of them. So it's like old school D&D kind of video game where you just have to pick which one you want to be good at and just kind of hope that the rest will grow as well with you, because
Yeah.
you're not going to be great at all of them. You know, you can be good at all of them. You can stand out really well at one, but all these other things are going to be hindered. But that's kind of like the beauty of it.
Yeah. I could definitely see that. Oh, that system versus style piece of advice, that's actually a very good way of putting it. Because that definitely happens in fencing too. You could talk about, different techniques and different ways of doing stuff all you want, but at the end of the day, if you hit the guy before he hits you, in a very general sense, that's all you have to do. I know for a fact that there have been times where my coach, like, he'll see his students get a touch, and points in fencing are called touches. He'll
Okay.
see one of his students get a touch in, like, in a very, like, they clearly messed up part of it, but still managed to salvage it enough to actually get it from their opponent.
That's
Or
what touche
maybe,
is, right? Touche
what?
is touch.
Yeah, it's the same spelling. The French pronunciation is touche. So it's, yeah, but in English, we just call it touch. So technically touche is a mispronunciation.
Oh,
Um,
that's good to know. We're learning something new today. I
yeah.
appreciate it.
Well, yeah, I learned that more than 10 years ago, and I still somehow forget that almost everyone else pronounces it touche. But yes, it's technically pronounced touche.
Okay, that's
Um,
good. I just learned something. I appreciate that.
yeah. Well, so like I was saying though, sometimes our coach will sort of, like, he's never said it specifically that way, but he definitely understands that distinction, because I
Mm.
have seen him, like, he'll watch his students, get a touch, not the way that they wanted, but they still got it. And sometimes it even is just straight up by accident, like, just a happy accident. I happened to get it, which I imagine probably wouldn't happen in MMA.
Oh, it
But
happens. There are plenty of hack. So the rule of thumb is you can have lucky punches, you don't get lucky submissions.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. But yeah, he'll if, especially if it's in practice, the students, and this has happened to me too, they'll be like, oh man, like, they'll beat themselves up about it. They'll be like, oh, I didn't do things right, and you do things better. And my coach will just say, shut up, you got the point. And so, I mean, maybe not candidly as that, but you get the idea that, there is that sort of mentality in fencing. There are definitely different styles that sometimes seem to go against the system, but because of the way it's done, it still works.
Yeah, it's
So,
crazy how that works. That's the
yeah.
beauty of it, right? That's the art part of what people do in combat, you know?
So I'm going to say, from my perspective, what I think would be the biggest advantage an MMA fighter might have transitioning to fencing, what I think would be the biggest disadvantages.
Okay.
I think and then we can hear your thoughts.
Oh, sure.
I think the biggest advantage would be the fact that they are used to fighting an opponent. Because, like I said, I've taught beginners before, and that's definitely one of the first things, that I try to make sure they know how to do, is to not only be unafraid of getting hit, because it's going to happen, but also unafraid of hitting their opponent. Because, like you mentioned, in fencing, there's not a whole lot of, reason to, like, hit someone with a lot of strength, with a lot of power, but there is a limit.
Mm.
In two of the styles, there are actual weight limits. In foil, you had to hit them with a pound of pressure to set it off. And in
Mm.
epee, it is a pound and a half. But it's more than that, because, if you miss your opponent because if you attack someone very lightly, and technically it would have the power to set it off still, if
Mm.
they lean back and your attack falls short by an inch, well, then you didn't do anything. But if you put more power into it, that extends your range. So even if they try to get away from it, they may not be able to. So there
Mm.
is that. And I feel like, a lot of that attacking lightly comes from, I've never hit someone before, whether with a sword or with a fist, and I'm nervous about it. I feel like an MMA fighter would not have that issue. So I think
No,
they would
no.
have the advantage there. I also think that even though the footwork is a little bit different, I think they would have sort of the advantage in, making the adjustments, because they clearly have a foundation. They have balance. They know how to move. There are just a few different ways of, adjusting it. Um, so I think, because fencers, we move very linearly. There's very little side to side movement. So, but the movement that we do, we're very good at.
Mm.
So I feel like, an MMA fighter, no matter what background they come from, probably, wouldn't be able to get it down all within a month, which is sort of the premise of the show that I'm watching, which is ridiculous.
Mm.
But I feel like they would have a good foundation to, actually do it, and not, by the end of the first lesson, their legs are burning. They keep
Mm.
straightening up out of their stance. I feel like an MMA fighter wouldn't do that. And I also think that they would probably, as long as they can get accustomed to only using one arm, because using the other arm in a fencing bout is obviously looked down upon and is a cardable offense. But I feel like once they sort of got used to the idea that they can only do it with one arm, whichever one they're holding their blade with, I feel like they would be very good at that and sort of have a jump start, as opposed to a lot of other people taking up fencing for the first time.
Mm.
Now, I think so. Those are the main advantages I think most fighters would have. I think
Mm.
some of the disadvantages would probably be the actual modifications that they have to do, because
Mm.
I have seen people. I've never taught someone who came from a martial art, but I have taught people who had like a previous fencing coach who honestly kind of taught them the wrong thing. And I would have to sort of teach them the right thing. And I think that's pretty transferable to if someone came from any other martial art to fencing,
Mm.
because they're different things. So I feel like there would be this period where they're a lot better than some of their peers in some things, but then a lot worse in others, because I feel like the advantages put them ahead, like the advantages put them here in terms of part of their form, but then the what they learned that does not line up with fencing would put them below. So they don't start in the middle, they start below it. So there are some things that they would have to unlearn before they can learn to do the right thing. And I feel like that's really what balances it out, and those are the main disadvantages. So basically, any direct difference in just system, I feel like would be, another monkey wrench thrown into the fencer's development. So like, for example, like the biggest example that I can think of is, like we mentioned before, with boxers moving their back leg forward at the wrong times. And I think that would be a disadvantage. But you could like really get into all of the little details that are different from wherever they came from to fencing. But I feel like that wouldn't be the main disadvantage in terms of having to overcome that. That's my 2 cents on
Mm.
it. I'd like to hear your thoughts, what you think an MMA fighter might have going for them, what they think they might not have going into fencing.
Well, I'll start like how you started with what I think the advantages would be. Um, First, like I think a big misconception about MMA is that MMA is an art in itself. MMA is a sport that is based off of a lot of different arts that come from a lot of different backgrounds. So when you're dealing with MMA fighters typically have to learn a lot of different arts. right? So they may have come from a Muay Thai background for their striking, but then they have to go to a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school to learn their groundwork. Well, those rules and how they learn things are going to be two completely separate things. So I actually kind of disagree with what you said about their having that learning curve, because they already are used to going from completely different things that have completely different rule sets. In order to become an MMA fighter, you would have already had to do that a lot, right? You would have already had to have a wrestling coach come in and tell you, well, this is how we're going to do our takedown. And then you go, well, my Muay Thai guy said this and my Jiu-Jitsu guy said this, but now I have to learn it this way. So I think that MMA fighters in general have a very good ability to adapt to learning new things because they don't have a choice, because it's kind of a part of their job already.
Oh,
So in
that's a
order to
good
be
point.
so in order to be efficient and be good at MMA, they have to be really good students. If you're not, you're going to get stagnant. You're not going to learn. You're not going to learn how to put those pieces together on your own and be efficient, because sometimes technically a lot of those arts can be contradictory to each other, because most of the time the art is built to keep you in that range of combat. And so that's my 2 cents about like them being efficient. Another thing is, because they're mixed martial artists, that last 2 words are very important: martial artists. Um, just because MMA does not allow weapons, MMA does not allow, obviously, you can't bring a stick in, you can't bring a sword in, right? But that doesn't mean that these people along their careers haven't taken the time to go to like a Kali and a Screama class, a Filipino martial arts class, where you learn weapons first. So like if you're learning Filipino martial arts, you actually learn stick and knife before you even learn how to use your hands, before you learn how to punch.
Hmm.
And one of the people who taught me, he was under a guy named Dan Inosanto, and then under Dan Inosanto, there was a guy named Paul Vunak. But Paul Vunak was the guy who taught me a lot about weapons, and he said the reason that you learn weapons first in the Filipino martial arts is very similar to driving your car on a highway and then pulling into a residential area. So like you're on the highway and you're going 70. Woo, woo, woo. Everything's going so quickly. Everything has such high risk, right? If you make a mistake, you will die because you're going like 75 miles an hour, right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, when you go into that residential area, well, your brain has already been adapted to 70 miles an hour, everything will kill you. And then when you go into a residential area, everything seems a way slower, not just because you're going slower, but because your car is going slower and now you're still processing at such a high level, your brain has to adapt back to where you are now. So things seem like you're going 5 when you're really going 30. Well, a lot of martial artists still do train weapons, even though they might be MMA guys. That doesn't mean that they're not learning weapons training and stuff like that already, because that actually gives you quite an advantage. So that's kind of like an interesting thing about MMA fighters is when you look at it from just a sport perspective, we forget about what it really is, which is an interwebbing of a lot of different martial arts. Now, I will say the disadvantage is the fact that they might come from a base martial art that does nothing with weapons and does nothing really with like learning how to use more like a striking art, which is basically what fencing is, because it's an extension of your arm. It's a striking art. You're still striking with the weapon.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so if they don't come from a striking background, it might be way more difficult for them to learn if they go, okay, well, I took a boxing class. I know jab, cross, hook, overhand. I know some basic head movement, and I'm okay at it, but that's not what I prefer. I just do that just so I'm good enough so that way I can entry into getting my takedowns because that's where I'm more comfortable. Well, those guys might have a harder time. And because they already are trying to fit their mold, which is I'm really good at this one thing and I'm okay at these things. So I just avoid these things at all costs just so I can get to the good thing. They'll probably have a really hard time adapting because you can't rely on your takedown. You can't be like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure they just disqualified you because you slammed this dude on his head. But it really is a very interesting thing. What I think a lot of people from the outside world view MMA. It's just like this beautiful broad web of different arts and different styles and all these different things. So like we do have like your typical MMA fighter, but really when you really start dissecting it, there is no typical MMA fighter. They all come from these vast backgrounds with these beautiful cultures and these different techniques and all these arts. And the reason I brought up cultures, not to digress, not to get
Yeah,
too
you're
far
fine.
off the subject, but Dan Inosanto is a legend in the martial arts industry. He was basically, I guess you could say, partner with Bruce Lee at the time. He has a saying that says, if you want to learn about a culture, you learn about their warriors first, because then you can find out what they were fighting for. And that's like a very interesting in-depth look at people who normally would be seen as maybe thugs or jocks or bullies or whatever, like these people who were supposed to protect you physically, right? They can't be smart. Well, if you really think about it, why are they fighting? Well, they're
Yeah.
fighting for a reason. What are they protecting? Well, if you learn about them first, you will learn about the rest of what they're doing, what they're protecting. You learn a lot about culture that way. I know that was a little off subject, but it just kind of hit me for there for a second.
Well, it was interesting, so you're good.
But yeah, I think that those are the advantages and disadvantages for sure. I will say I come from a background, one of my black belts is in a weapon system called Jodo. Now, Jodo is a French weapon system. Not a lot of people have heard of it. It's very small, and I'm pretty sure I'm probably like one of the only like 10 people on the planet with a black belt on with it right now. So like, it's not a very big style, but the idea is nothing changes from weapon to weapon but intent. And like you were talking about like angles of attack earlier. Well, that's very similar. Like if I go to stab you with this pen and like Eskrima, Kali, Filipino martial arts, and even the system that I was doing, right? This is angle one, right? Whether I'm trying to slash you, whether I'm trying to hit you with a chair, whether I'm trying to hit you with a pipe, whether I'm trying to hit you with a bottle, the angle is what you're dealing with more than necessarily the weapon itself. But the intent might change. So like, for instance, like in fencing, one of the swords is more for stabbing, specifically for stabbing, not necessarily going to do much for cutting. Still would hurt like a bitch if you got hit with it, but
Oh
you know,
yeah.
yeah, it's more not meant for that. It's more for piercing. Whereas another might be specifically made, like a katana, for instance, isn't not like it's not made for stabbing, but it's more made for cutting, right? But the angle of attack would still remain the same. This would still be angle number for us anyway, would be angle number 5. Straight in attacking would be considered angle 5 for us. Well,
Okay.
if I did that with a pin or if I did that with a punch, nothing really changes in terms of what's coming at me, just intent. The punch is trying to bludgeon me, whereas the sword or the knife is trying to cut me or stab me. Still the same angle, though.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that is actually something that does come up in fencing because two of the weapons, the foil and epee, are thrust only.
Okay.
And what that means is that, obviously you can only hit with the tip of the blade. If you were to hit with the flat of the blade, what we call slap, um, you know, you will feel it, but it will literally do nothing. It doesn't even, if you hit your opponent off target, that stops the action. If you hit your opponent with the flat of the blade, no matter where you did it, it doesn't stop the action at all. So it's an extreme hindrance because now your blade is caught up in something and nothing, the ref isn't going to help you in this case. But the third weapon, the saber, that's sort of another example of it, is you can thrust with it, but it's primarily a cutting weapon, and it is far easier to cut with the saber than it is to thrust. So you can do it, it's just, it's usually not advantageous. So that parallel does exist with fencing, and the intents behind it, whether it's a thrust only weapon or a cutting weapon, that definitely also changes not just which parries you have, but also how you do them and sort of how you even follow up with it. Like throwing rules out the window, it still has a massive effect in how you defend yourself. Because, the rules don't matter if your parry just wasn't good enough and the attack got through anyways. There's no amount of rule lawyering that can, work your way around your opponent getting a light and you getting nothing, which means your opponent hit you and you didn't hit them. It doesn't matter in terms of the rules. What happened before that, that is incontestable. So even, disregarding the rules of fencing, that's something that, you have to have the right parry at the right time for the right attack. And that varies greatly between the three styles because there is that difference of intention.
You actually bring up something that's kind of important when it comes to any combat art, which is there are only 4 outcomes of a fight. That's it. No matter how many ways you slice it, there are only 4 outcomes of a fight, right? I hit you, you hit me, right? We both lose, right? Because if I stab you in the face and you stab me in the face, we both equally are stabbed in the face, right? I miss you and you miss me. Hey, we're both winning, in my opinion. All right. Either one of us got hurt. I'm not dead and stabbed. You're not dead and stabbed. We're all happy, right?
Yeah.
I hit you and you miss me, which is my ultimate goal, right? I hit you, you missed. Well, I win. Or you hit me and I miss you. But other than that, there are no other outcomes that could possibly come from striking in combat. Is that's it. Those are it. And I think that
Yeah.
once people come to peace with that, it makes things so much simpler than trying to compartmentalize and make all these different scenarios. Like there are only 4 scenarios. That's it. Those 4 scenarios are the only things that could possibly happen. I think once people start understanding that, they start learning so much easier because it makes things a lot less. I guess it makes things seem a lot less big when you're first starting something. You know, when you first start, you're like, oh my God, all these people are doing all these things. What's that? What's that? What's that? Don't worry about that. You hit them, don't let them hit you. That's it. That's all you need to worry about. And then
Yeah,
just keep
yeah.
working on that.
Yeah, that comes up in fencing a lot too. And actually, now that you brought it up, that may even be an advantage that martial artists might bring over to fencing, because fencing, depending on what you do, has, a lot of rules to it. It's
Mm,
not enough to know, how to do something and whether or not you're physically fit enough to do it, or whether even your technique is good enough. There are times to attack and times to not.
mm.
So, like, for example, in foil and saber, there's a system of rules called priority, which
Okay.
ensures that only one person can score at a time. And, a very rough idea of it is, if my opponent attacks first, they have priority. I need to get priority in order to score. I can do that by either, backing up out of the way so that their attack falls short, or first defending myself. Once I
Mm,
defend myself, their priority is gone. Once I attack, I have taken priority. And so it's sort of this back and forth thing. And it's something that, really governs how foil and saber is fenced. Epee doesn't have it, but there's still so much strategy to epee that it may as well have priority. But that's something that I think, now that you brought it up, I think could possibly help a lot of martial artists, because they don't have that system of rules. So it might be a little bit more simple to sort of, learn how to actually fight, like learn whatever styles that they come from before learning fencing. Because I have definitely seen not just, beginners being overwhelmed with all the rules, but also more advanced students. They will get, and I guarantee you this will still happen no matter what level of fencing you're talking about. Eventually you get to the point where, you're trying to think about, what's going to happen, 10 moves into the future of the bout. Like, you know, a lot of people refer to fencing as physical chess.
mm.
And to me, that's a very apt description. But sometimes it is possible to, think too far ahead, to get too caught up into the rules of it. I can't tell you how many times I've stepped forward and I have this intricate plan of what I'm going to do. I'm going to be like, all right, so they've done this, for the past 5 touches, they usually reacted to this. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to set this up, and then I'm going to go for that. And now I'm going to execute, and I got hit because I started thinking too hard and my opponent just bull rushed me, basically.
Yeah,
So
which is
it's
funny. Like that's a Bruce Lee quote. It's like one of my favorites. It's when he first started learning about martial arts, or before he learned martial arts, a kick was just a kick and a punch was just a punch. That's how he saw it, right? And then when he started learning martial arts, he was like, a kick is more than a kick and a punch is more than a punch, right? You start thinking about it so much and all these different kicks and punches. And he said once he got good at it, he realized yet again that a kick is just a kick and a punch is just a punch. So rather than trying to overthink things and make things so complicated, keeping them simple is actually one of the more handy things to do with pretty much anything. Because I mean, that goes with like the 4 stages of learning. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the 4 stages of learning.
no.
So you have unconscious incompetence, you have conscious incompetence, then you have conscious competence, then you have unconscious competence. So unconscious incompetence is, I guess we could just say, like driving a car, right? When you're a newborn baby, you don't know that you don't know how to drive a car because you don't know that a car even exists. So that's the unconscious incompetence. You're unaware that you don't know something because you don't even know that that something even exists,
Yeah.
right? Then after you learn about that something, you go, okay, I know that there's a car there, but now I'm aware that I don't know how to drive it. So I'm looking at the car and I go, well, I mean, I see it going, but I have no clue how it works, how it operates, or how to drive it. Well, then you start learning how to drive and you have to think about everything that you do, which is that conscious competence, right? All right, well, I got to think about where to put my hands. I got to make sure I check my thing, seat belts, rear view mirrors. All right, check the speedometer as I'm driving every 30 seconds to make sure I'm not speeding, that kind of thing. But then after you start driving for a while, you don't have to think about it. It's unconscious. You just do it. And so you're competent at doing this thing, but you're just not conscious of doing it. You just do it. You don't have to think about it. So
Yeah, yeah.
fighting is very similar to where when you first look at fighting, you don't know that you don't know how to fight. Most people on the world don't know they don't know how to fight. They are
Yeah.
quite aware in their head. They've made up this story that they are phenomenal fighters, even though they've never trained with a real fighter and they've never been in a real fight. They're just confident that they can do it. That's called unconscious incompetence. They are unaware that they are being very dumb when they make that statement. Then they go to a class and they get worked over. And I'm sure it's the same thing in fencing, right? Somebody goes,
Yep.
this looks pretty easy. I could do
Yep.
this. And then they just get hammered. They're like, holy shit, I don't know what I'm doing. And that brings you to the third stage of learning. All right, now I have to think about this and I have to learn it. I have to actually throw my bullshit ego aside and go, okay, I admit defeat that I don't know how to do this, but I'm going to learn it. And then that's that learning process, is that third stage of learning where you're actually learning something, right? And then the last stage is when you start just becoming, I guess, what would be the equivalent of like somebody who has more mastered their craft. You just do it, right?
Yeah.
Even if
Yeah.
you're not the best in the world, I don't need to think about how to do a rear naked choke anymore. I just do the rear naked choke. I don't have to sit there and go, well, now it goes here. And then if I don't, I grabbed the wrong thing. No, you just do it, right? I'm sure
Yeah.
it's very similar in fencing where like with pretty much anything, I guess, is that when you're learning something, you have to go through these stages. And then when you get there, you start to realize, at the end of the day, I just fall back on the things that I learned. I just enjoy the ride and I just have fun doing it. And then if I learn the fact that I don't know what I'm doing first, then you're already going to be a master of it eventually.
Yeah. I've never heard the process explained that way before, but it totally makes sense. I've seen it all the time. And I have heard, lessons that sort of focus on that. So whenever someone makes a parry, which is a defense, then they want to do a riposte, which is basically just the attack that follows after a parry. And I
Yeah.
have, every coach wants their student to riposte without even thinking about it. Because as soon as you think about it, it slows down and you've probably lost the advantage. I have literally seen coaches make their students do push-ups after a bout because they were like, you parried and then you didn't riposte. What are you doing?
Mm.
So that's a bit of an extreme example, but it's an example of how we try to, basically not think. And I've seen a lot of students coming into fencing. They go, what do you mean I can't think? You don't want me to think? And we're like, no, we don't. Because if you're thinking about it, you're not doing it. We want you to just do it. And, I understand you have to think about it to learn how to then not think about it. But
that's
yeah,
the that's the oxymoron of it all, but
yeah,
it's true. It's true. You want to have the process of thinking about it, but then eventually the ultimate goal is just to do it. I mean, The Last Samurai is probably one of the best movies to actually bring it up. It's a beautiful example of the stages, right?
？Nicely done. 小さいがなかなか筋がいい。You tried. Fight. Come in. 刀を下ろせ。
He doesn't know how to fight with a sword like that. So he picks up a bokken or a wooden sword, and he goes up to the dude, the kid, in the rain, and the kid actually starts beating his ass a little bit with the sword. And then eventually he's tired of this kid beating his ass with the sword, the wooden sword, so he grabs it out of the kid's hand. And then so he winds up giving the other wood sword to another samurai who walks up, who thinks that he's picking on this kid. And so when he does, the dude with the bokken just starts whooping his ass in this rain and knocks him unconscious. So then the next day, he's like, he just went through the 2 stages right off the bat, right? He went through, I don't know what that is. Let me go find out. And then he realized, oh, I really suck at this. Oh, I'm knocked unconscious. Then the next day, the very next day, he went, you know what? I want to learn how to do this. And so he went through the process and he went through the process. And the one thing that he kept hearing from one of his instructors in the movie was no mind. No mind. And he kept just saying it over and over again. And then finally he realized and it clicked what that meant was stop thinking so much.
Yeah.
Just do it. Like if you practice something 1,000 times, right, and you're still thinking about it, you need to start practicing without thinking about it, right? You got it, right? Just trust and have some faith in the fact that you've trained enough at this that it's there. Just do it, man. You know?
Yeah, yeah. All right, so we've been getting into, you know, a lot of really what it takes to actually learn fencing, actually learn martial arts. I think this is coming to a good time to close. So, I have a question.
I have an answer, I hope.
Well, it's an opinion question, so I really hope you do. I already have my answer, and
Okay.
I'm pretty sure it's going to be the same as yours. Do you think that someone who has been fighting for, you know, maybe a couple years, they don't actually say in the show, could, with a less than a month of training, beat someone in a fencing bout who has been doing it for 15 years?
No, I don't think that that's how that's going to go down.
Yeah.
But I think that that's just like anything else, right? Like me personally, like to say that I've been doing chess since I was a kid would be a fallacy. That'd be a lot. I've practiced chess from time to time. I've played the art of chess. I've played the game, right? But I've never learned it and studied it under somebody who truly knows that game like the back of their hand.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of like that. Like just because some of those things might match up, there's still a lot of holes there that you would really need to analyze, take the time to learn. Am I saying that it's impossible? No, I don't think that anything's impossible. I think there might be that 1 in a million roll of the dice where you got somebody who just naturally got it, right? But that's damn near impossible because most of that time is built with muscle memory. It's built with time, dedication to the art. And let's say even if you did decide that you're going to train every day for 4 or 5 hours a day, you'll get good quicker for sure. But even in the rest periods is when I find that I learn the most. Like the times where I've taken like a couple weeks off of training and come back, like my brain is fresh now. It's not like over stimulated with too much information. So when I
Yeah.
come back, I don't have a high expectation of how I'll do. I don't have a lot of thoughts cluttering me, like what happened the previous class or what might happen. I don't put too much expectation on the fact that I might win today or do well today because I know I won't. And then you just get in there and you realize, oh, by me relaxing and taking a little bit of time off, I'm now learning more than trying to cram it all into just such a short period of time. Physical activity is not one of those things that you can cram like a test. You don't get to go, oh, well, I was 575 pounds yesterday, but if I work out really hard for a month straight, then I'll be 100 pounds tomorrow. That's not how physical activity works. You can't cram for it like it's a test. Muscle memory takes time and dedication and a lot of sacrifice. And one of those main sacrifices is time, like we just talked about.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Do I think that it's possible? Maybe a 1 in a billion shot, maybe, right?
I think the only way it would happen is if your opponent did something so stupid that they literally got disqualified. I think that's the only way that could happen.
Maybe you win via heart attack. Like you walk out and
yeah.
well, I win, I guess.
Yeah, like.
But yeah, my answer would be definitely no. I don't think that that's realistic. I think that that's very fantasized. See, the hard part about the Karate Kid is that you don't know exactly how much time they were really training together, but you get like an idea that it wasn't very long.
Yeah,
If Daniel's son is able to beat the crap out of this kid who's been doing it his entire life, then that kid who's been doing this his entire life, it's time for him to go change gyms.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that. I will say one advantage that every beginner has is unpredictability. They definitely, I've seen pretty good fencers, not like really experienced because once you get to a certain point, it just doesn't matter. Yeah. But like, pretty good fencers will, get like taken aback, like, wait, what did that beginner just do? Why did they do that? Oh, I guess it doesn't matter because they got the point. But that's like, in a standard direct elimination bout, that'll happen maybe once or twice. So the final score is still 15-2. So it doesn't really matter. And, to people that have also that I've been talking to about the show, I've brought up to them, the most naturally talented guy I've ever seen. He didn't come from martial art, but he was very athletic. The most talented, naturally gifted fencer I've ever met. Still, it took him about a year before he was ready to go to a tournament. And he still lost. So, I was just, when I heard, less than a month to pick this stuff up, even if you have a background, I was like at that point, I was just insulted. Like, oh, you think fencing is so easy?
Well, like, I can get that. I can get how you could be insulted by something like that, especially if you put a lot of time, effort, energy, and dedication into a craft, and then somebody comes along and makes a show or makes a movie or makes not a documentary, but makes a show or makes a movie or a series about fencing or about your craft. And they show you, oh man, it's easy. We just pick it up. And you go, well, fuck you. Like, that's not it at all. Like, how rude of you? Like, how about you show the real stuff? It's the same thing when I see like a martial arts movie where they have those montages where you assume only a couple weeks has gone by. Like the dude has the same facial hair on day 1 that he did on day 5.
Yeah.
It's like, that's not how any of this is going to work.
Yeah.
Like, I do see how that could be insulting, but then again, I always have to remind myself, it's just a movie, it's just a show, but then, when people come in and if that is the basis for them starting fencing, right? Let's say they watch the show, they're like, oh man, that got me excited to fence, right? I'd be grateful for that. But then when they come in as a coach and you actually show them the real path or you show them really what it's like, that drastic difference will be a big eye opener for, I think, for a lot of people. I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that's very humbling.
Yeah, that has definitely happened a lot in fencing. Because the thing is, if someone joins a martial arts gym because they saw that martial art in a movie, maybe, yeah, there were a bunch of fallacies and, it doesn't quite line up, but at least you saw what they were doing. But
Yeah.
in fencing, all the time, we get people coming in like, I saw The Princess Bride and now I want to fence, or I saw Pirates of the Caribbean and now I want to fence. Like, every time a major sword fighting movie comes out, it introduces a whole slew of fencers. And,
Yeah.
there is a high attrition rate in fencing, so a lot of them drop off after a while. But some of the best fencers I know got started because they watched a movie. But the thing is, all these movies, they don't show, sport fencing. They show sword fighting.
Yeah.
So, on the one hand, people coming in, they know it's different. But on the other, maybe it's a little bit more different than they thought.
That like a
But
South Park episode, like South Park did that where the kids wanted to learn how to wrestle. And so
oh
they
yeah, yeah.
WWE, and then they go to high school wrestling and you're like, what is this?
That was that was a great episode. That was one of my favorites. But yeah, that's a very good example. And then they go off and try doing it themselves. Fortunately, I've not met anyone who has decided to do that with fencing. But I'm
That's
very
probably a
glad
good
that
thing.
they
You
did.
probably just get stabbed.
Oh, actually, I lied. Lightsabers. Lightsaber dueling is actually becoming a thing. So
That
I
is a
feel like
thing. I've seen a lot
that
of that as well.
that is happening. So I guess it does happen. People go to a fencing club. It's not like the lightsabers, so they go do their own thing with the lightsabers. Which is totally fine. Like, anyone coming into a physical activity, something close to fencing, even if they give up after a couple years, it's like, well, hey, we were glad to have you. We're glad for whatever, these misinterpreted shows, however many people they bring into the sport. But it would be nice to be represented a little bit better.
Yeah, I can understand for sure.
Because then, I have some upstart coming up to me saying, hey, I think I could beat you now. I'm like, well, maybe not.
Yeah.
You're welcome to try, though.
Good luck.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. When I first reached out to you, it was on a whim. I honestly didn't think you'd say anything, but you did. You agreed to be part of this, and I was really grateful for the feedback. I learned a ton of stuff today, and I think we got a nice long discussion out of it. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, man. Thank you for having me on, dude. I've made two decisions when doing this page now, especially now that I do it for a living, and I'll never stray away from those two things. One, whoever sends me a message, I'll always answer it because I think it's super pretentious for somebody to read a message and not respond. Like to me, that's ego talking. Like I'm too good for this conversation. Like, dude, get over yourself.
Yeah.
I'm not that important. I'm just some dude who loves what I do. And then the other thing was when somebody ever invited me on their show, podcast, whatever, like I can't tell you how many times I've been the first guest on someone's podcast because like they just ask and they're like, well, it's not very big. I don't care. I don't care if you have one person or 1,000. It doesn't matter to me. We're having a conversation, right? Why not chit chat and then just enjoy a conversation? Like I think that art is being lost, and I think that it's important to me.
Yeah, especially when, I'm trying to educate people about this. I bring in another educator. I think it's great.
Yeah, dude. I'm all about it.
Yeah, well, on that note, you actually are the first guest I've ever had on here.
Boom. Nice.
Yeah.
High five to me.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I hope you guys enjoyed this. And I will see you next week. Bye.